pushing through a wardrobe of clothes to enter a hidden world of magic and mystery. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe sold more than 85 million copies worldwide. And as C.S. Lewis's classic novel celebrates its 75th anniversary, what is it about this much-loved fictional land of Narnia that continues to entice and entertain not only children, but adults like us too? I'm Vicky Gibbens and welcome to UCB's Life Issues with my guest, Dr Jem Bloomfield, an academic, writer and reader in the Church of England. Jem, it's a 7-book fantasy series, The Chronicles of Narnia, some of which have been made into films as well as plays. We're focusing on The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe today. You have studied and written a number of books on C.S. Lewis's classics, but what's your personal earliest memory of being captured by Narnia?
Thanks so much for inviting me on. Yes, they're wonderful works, aren't they? And as you say, I think embedded in the childhood of a lot of people. My first encounter with the books was not, in fact, with the books. It was with the television version of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe that was broadcast. I seem to remember about 4 o'clock, certainly tea time, for whatever age I was at the time, on a Sunday afternoon. Yeah, and it was absolutely entrancing, absolutely fascinating stuff. It was the kind of story that I hadn't seen before. I remember being absolutely convinced for some weeks that Malgrim, the head of the Queen's Secret Police, was in fact living in the bookshelves and the wardrobe in my own room. It possibly had a little bit too much of an impression on me. But yeah, just absolutely magic stuff, and perfectly parcelled out, because of course in those days no such thing as streaming or binging or box setting or whatever. One had to wait till an entire week until next Sunday tea time. So yeah, that was my first encounter, and then I came to read the stories myself.
That was when we had the joy of anticipation. I think it was, for me, it was the White Witch that really struck that fear inside of me when I first came across the land of Narnia. Let's briefly talk about C.S. Lewis, although today we're not overly focusing on his life. But it is interesting with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. There have been so many scholars who've discussed the layers within the text and all sorts of interpretations and allegories. And what was his intention for writing this book? It wasn't solely about trying to convert children to Christianity.
No, as you say, there's some really interesting scholarship on Lewis's own life, and he discusses the sort of purpose behind the books at various points in letters. Although I have a literature scholar's suspicion of authors explaining their own work. I always think that these books particularly, but books generally, are so rich and so multi-layered, as you say, that it's difficult to reduce them to even what the author thought they were about. But looking at the shape of them and looking at the way that Lewis's imagination, his vision, made itself felt, they are clearly intended to show something of the mystery and something of the splendor that's inside the Christian story. I think it was Rowan Williams who said that they're not about Christianity, they're about what Christianity is about. Past the stained glass and the hymn books. And I do not knock either stained glass or hymn books. I'm very fond of both. But it is an attempt to body forth, for a reader, particularly for a young reader, some of that mystery and marvel and some of the account with something other but beneficent and divine. I think for Lewis as well, personally, the form the stories take, the fact that we've got Father Christmas and sort of a frost queen from northern myth, and also a classical satyr, and also a dwarf and a centaur, etc., in the same novel, with talking animals that could be from Aesop or could be from Beatrix Potter or something. There seems to be a drive in his work to gather all mythologies together, and to sort of explore how they refract that one great story, how they're all intelligible through the Logos, this generous gathering of all kinds of myth and story, and using them to construct this tale of sort of redemption and salvation.
There are so many themes that we can pick up on, as well as characters. We're only going to have time to focus on a few. So shall we begin with the children, if you like, some of the heroes and heroines of this story? We're in the Second World War, And I mean, when this book was first written, I guess even for a lot of adults, there would have been fresh memories of what life was like as an evacuee, as a child. How relatable then is it when you think about today's children and young people and the digital world that they now live in, and yet these books are as popular as ever?
It's really interesting, isn't it? They're of a generation where I think a lot of modern writers and some modern readers are quite uncomfortable with the sort of slightly Swallows and Amazons or Enid Blyton Famous Five sort of approach to children's literature. Although, a lot of children seem to enjoy it. I think critics and novelists are often more suspicious of text than writers are. Sorry, than readers, I beg your pardon, are. But yeah, it is interesting that they still hold the attention. You're right. We are not a generation that has been sort of evacuated to the countryside, nor have we spent our time, exploring either the woods and fields outside an old deserted manor house or a wardrobe inside it. They do, however, I think, testify to something quite important about children's view of the world, that the world is more exciting and more enchanted than modern civilization. It's a very sweeping term. Modern culture, shall we say, will allow it. One of the intriguing things I think that the novels do, particularly The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, is they face us with this magical, fantastical world where there are fauns and dryads and Father Christmas, all this sort of thing. But the first question that Lucy is asked when she finds her way into Narnia is, who are you? Or rather, what are you, in fact? Tumnus, this goat-legged, goat-horned, enchanted creature, is terribly excited that he's met a girl, a daughter of Eve, a human being, etc. And the novel seems to strongly suggest that is much more exciting than being a faun in a classical landscape. That there is something marvellous, mysterious, and that she's, by very nature of being a girl, called to a high and noble destiny. Perhaps it's less the setting than the ethos or the impulse of the stories. I also think the landscape that they depict, as you say, it's a post-war landscape. There's rationing, there's physical hardship, things that many children face today. But also that there is a sense, I think, in modern culture that the world is inhospitable to enchantment. That to be truly engaged with the world, engaged with society, is to have to put away childish things and not believe in enchantments or magic. And I think that that was the case in the 1950s as well. We might think of that as a very modern notion, but I think people in the 1950s also thought it was a very modern notion. Perhaps they look back to The Wind of the Willows or Edwardian works by E. Nesbit or something. I think they both periods share this sense that children's literature can offer enchantment, can offer genuine mystery.
And yet for these children, Peter, Edmund, Susan and Lucy, they were essentially escaping one war to take up arms in another war. Remind us of the significance of the prophecy and I guess perhaps the forgotten hope that existed in Narnia.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? They're often discussed or even dismissed as novels that are escapist, juvenile, want to sort of inscribe a simple meaning on life. But as you say, they are escaping from one war towards another. In fact, the novels suggest that there is a greater conflict than the individual strife between nations going on. Lewis gave a speech, I think it's on learning in wartime, in which he discusses basically what addressing young people who are studying at university during the war, some of whom have sort of had their conscription sort of delayed for that purpose, and some of whom aren't conscripted yet. And he basically says, you think you're in the middle of a worldwide classicism. You are. It's always been going on. Do you think people in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages didn't have this problem? It's more immediate for you, but there's always been a great struggle going on, which possibly seemed a little bit glib, possibly for me to say that, but I think it seemed less glib in wartime Oxford, when they were dealing with people who actually were going to be, shipped off to the front. There's a sense as soon as the children, or relatively soon as the children enter, that there's a purpose for them there. As you say, there's a prophecy about them, the sons of Adam, the daughters of Eve. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bones sit in care Parabel alone, the evil time shall be over and done. And you can tell it's a prophecy because your boy Lewis has written it in not quite rhyming, vaguely medieval English. He's a scholar of language as well as a scholar of literature. And he just, I really love the way he just manages to adjust the sound of the texture and the texture of the language at that point so that it sounds like a prophecy. It's calling them further into a sense that the world is older and more deep than they thought.
And why does it matter, those names, sons of Adam and daughters of Eve? Good question.
I mean, by all accounts, he seems to have poached the phrase from a bit in Puck of Pook's Hill, where Puck appears out of said hill and talks to the human children, and they refer to him as a fairy, or they say, but aren't you a fairy? And he says, you've never heard me use that phrase. Don't like that phrase. How would you like it if people call you son of Adam and daughter of Eve? And they say, we wouldn't like that at all. That's very weird. And so I think Lewis has lifted that little comic episode, but as you say, used it for a much more striking and serious purpose here. It resets the children's sense of themselves and indeed sense of their purpose in an explicitly longer, more ancient and biblical mode. It says to be a boy or a girl in the 1950s, or indeed, the 2020s, is to be an inheritor of that line, is to be conscious of a much longer story that isn't about your individual, grabbing or getting or whatever, or is it about the circumstances that you're specifically involved in? And of course, as we will see in the later novels, to be a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve is to be part of a line that has problems, as well as glories. Aslan says at one point that's enough to bow the head of the greatest emperor on earth and enough to lift the chin of the poorest beggar in the street.
And so when we think about these children, what I find quite interesting is quite early on in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is C.S. Lewis introducing the idea of disbelief. You see it in the interactions between the siblings, and it takes the professor to actually start the children to question, well, actually, could Lucy be telling the truth if it's not her telling lies or madness?
The sort of children's literature that he's drawing on does have, one thing particularly of E. Nesbit and the Phoenix and the Carpet and stuff like that, the Samiad, does have obviously children who have mysterious things happen to them, and then the adults say, oh, that's nice, dear, what a nice game you've been playing, why don't you come in for tea, etc. But yeah, Lewis takes it much further in positing that there are things that might be mysterious, miraculous, so that other people might not believe you. And he poses a version, the professor does, of what became known as Lewis's trilemma. Either your sister is mad, or she's lying, or she's telling the truth. Which is he slightly stacked the deck there, because we as the reader have seen that she's telling the truth. So I don't think it's specifically a philosophical argument. But yeah, he introduces both this idea of enchantment and this idea of a world that is more mysterious and more magical, but also the possibility that people might resist it. Again, not to look too far into the other novels, but of course at one point one of the characters starts denying that it ever happened.
If we can for a moment, given that we are near the start of this journey into Narnia together, we're surrounded by snow. I mean, children absolutely delight normally in a snow day, any excuse to have some fun. But the idea of pathetic fallacy and giving human emotions to non-human things like the seasons. I mean, Narnia is forever in winter. It's in a place of decline and decay, but there is promise of change, new life and spring. How much do you think Lewis, is putting symbolism through the seasons in this story?
Oh, very much so, yes. Of course, in his magical universe, it's literally winter until his Aslan figure arrives. Yes, it is oddly medieval in that sense. It's not the cosy Dickensian, isn't it nice to have snow outside and games. It's much more, this is rotten, the crops may die, we won't be able to plough the fields properly. It's got a much older sense of the seasons. But again, that is interwoven, isn't it, as you say, with the idea of New Hope. There's a chapter called Aslan is Nearer. And spoilers, Aslan is not in it. We don't see Aslan gradually getting nearer. What we do get is pages of descriptions of flowers and the movement of wind in leaves and the drip of snow as it melts and goes into brooks and stuff. which seems to me to be channeling those passages in the Song of Songs, where the voice of the turtle is heard in the land, and the foxes are running around the vineyards, and the new growth is happening. The arrival of Aslan, or even the imminent arrival of Aslan, as you say, seems to push the seasons through, seems to give a sense that quickening, that enlivening that we see in spring is actually reflecting something even greater and even more alive.
Now, you have already mentioned Mr. Tumnus. Many of Narnia's characters are known to children when we think of, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, for instance. But interesting, C.S. Lewis wanted to include a faun, given that so much has been written about this kind of blend of human-goat creature within Greek and Roman mythology. And yet here we are in the world of Narnia, and the faun is quite an important character when we think about continuity, but also the first character that Lucy meets.
Yeah, he's fascinating, isn't he? People are weird about Mr. Tumnus, I tell you. When I've been looking for pictures online for slides for lectures on Narnia, I've found things I wish I hadn't seen. And it's fascinating, given that he's a relatively minor character in the actual story. Less happens with him than happens with Mr. Beaver, or certainly with Aslan. He doesn't travel all the way through. He gets nabbed fairly early on, and then they go and release him. So yeah, he is intriguing, and he's very, very memorable. He's I suspect Lewis sometimes writes about the way in which these strong images come to him, and he tries to write them into his stories. I suspect the faun walking in the woods was an image that he then worked into this story. It's interesting, as you said, that he's half man. I mean, obviously he's borrowed from classical mythology, but Lewis has borrowed a figure who's half man and half animal. Given that Narnia is the land of the talking beasts, I wonder whether the fact that we meet him first is sort of we're easing into a world where we have to accept that animals have the gift of speech, the gift of reason, and apparently the salvation of the world is a creature, a talking lion. He's also, I think, a reflection of the interest in paganism. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, you get loads of writers like, Kenneth Grahame in The Wind to the Willows has that scene, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, where Ratty and Mole go and looking for the Otter's child, and they meet Pan in the middle of the English countryside. And that is just one example of, Hector Human Rowe does it in his Saki stories. People love writing about Pan in this period as this very, again, deep, ancient sort of paganism of the land. And for Lewis, of course, in his novel, a Pan-like figure is the first creature to greet the daughter of Eve as she enters. But he's not the end goal of the quest. He's someone who's interesting and funny, and of course potentially dangerous, because he tries to betray Lucy, or indeed he tries to, and then he tries not to, and apologizes to her and asks for forgiveness. Very striking that he's the first person to ask for forgiveness in the novel. It's interesting that he may only be half human and half beast, but he understands the nature of sin more quickly than many other characters do in this novel. But yeah, that he's the call of the wood, the strangeness, the Pan figure is not the center of the novel as it is with Kenneth Grahame, but it's the first thing that you meet that then draws you into the deeper mystery that can, only be glimpsed in the movement of the land and the wood itself until Aslan arrives.
I loosely think of the disciple Peter when I think of Mr. Tumnus, to be honest, wanting to do good, then denying Jesus, and then eventually finding that place of restoration in Jesus with his own personal journey. Through his story and interaction with Lucy, we see this beautiful moment, though, of friendship that is created. And children are meant to be afraid of the unknown, and yet here we see this faun fumbling around with his dropped presents, and as scared and fearful of Lucy as Lucy is too. I guess perhaps part of the popularity is it that shared vulnerability and actually, the beautiful hospitality that we then see, which is why his rescue is so important.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Now you mention he's like Peter, you're absolutely right, because of course he literally gets turned into stone. he becomes a rock. So once there's a very Lewisian pun going on there. It's a character who, as you say, knows he has sinned and then literally becomes the rock, and then is sort of revitalized. Yeah, the idea of it is so striking, as you say, that the first creature she meets is not this, is neither a dragon nor a terrible witch nor a lion, but this small bourgeois, fussy little creature who has a little. I mean, it's a cave it's called a cave, but it's basically a hobbit hole. It has a lot in common, I think, with the fact that both Tolkien and Lewis sort of ease us into their magical worlds by showing us a particular corner of the fantastical that is a bit more like what we've been used to.
But, I mean, Tumnus, as you say, dropping Lucy in it, we see then we go back to the Pevensies and the interactions, and they all end up eventually in Narnia. Let's focus on Turkish Delight. I mean, why wouldn't we, as part of this podcast, talk about Turkish Delight? Edmund's fall is fascinating. I think Edmund's character is just so intriguing because we could say, well, what happens with Edmund is a trick, it's a spell to do with the witch, but actually it's much more than that. It's about personal choice, it's about desire. I mean, here we have quite a mean character, an immature character, and yet he goes on such a journey of transformation in this book.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as you say, Turkish Delight, big thing.
Do you like Turkish Delight?
I'm not a big fan, I'll admit to you. Neither the sort of violently purple fries Turkish Delight, nor the stuff that you actually eat, on the continent that may have come from Turkey. No, I've never got into it personally. But yeah, I think, as you say, it's in many ways a novel about sort of Edmund's desire and his temptation, his hard realization of himself. The Turkish Delight, I think, is very striking because obviously rationing is still going on in this period. You've talked about it being as a post-war novel, and rationing doesn't end for another couple of years after this novel came out. So that the idea that this is not just a greedy boy who wants sweets. This is a guy who's never been allowed to buy as many sweets as he wanted. This is someone who's offering him something very special. It's interesting that you say, yes, it's about sort of the desire's gone wrong. It's easier for us, I think, to read this as about a kid who wants to eat sweets, and that's bad for him because wellness and health and obesity crisis, etc. Of course, it was bad for other people in the 1950s. The idea of rationing is based on this sort of slogan of fair shares. That we don't have more meat or more butter or more clothes than we need, because that will be taking it away from someone else. And of course, anyone, not to over-historicize the novel, but anyone who can offer a child as much sweets as they want, and she says, "Oh, I've got endless Turkish Delight, endless sweets," is in with some pretty nasty people. People running boats, off the coast, people bringing in smuggling stuff, people deliberately flouting the Defence of the Realm Act. Edmund knows that he shouldn't take these sweets because they shouldn't be available to him, and it's very quick. The way Lewis goes from, "I'd like these sweets and I shouldn't have them," and she says, "Oh, bring your brothers and sisters," and he said, "Oh, you needn't bother about them." He immediately betrays his family. It's not just a sin against healthy eating and his own body. It's a desire to exclude his family, to cut natural ties, to have more than he should in a way that he knows he's getting things at other people's expense.
In a way, it's seeking power, and I guess a revelation of the pride that he has as well. But for the witch, what was her motivation in her actions?
Yes, she, as you say, I'm absolutely pride. Lewis is very, very hard on pride. He regards it as, what does he call it, the complete anti-God state of mind or something. He says, other wrong desires can be satisfied. Pride, because it's completely inordinate, you can never have enough. It's about putting other people down, so you'll never be higher enough above other people to check your pride. For the Queen, I think this is a really interesting portrait of tyranny. She's someone who rules over this land, who specifically has a secret police. You know, the Tumnus is dragged off by Malgrim, who signs himself head of the secret police. You know, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, or Gestapo. I think anyone reading that at the time, you know, secret police is a very specific term, or, you know, a political police. She is a sketch both, I think, of sort of wartime tyranny and post-war Cold War tyranny. She's someone who, she very quickly goes from, I want to stop this prophecy because, basically because I don't want anyone to take my power off me, to I need to control language and reality itself. There's something very, very totalitarian about the way she meets these creatures, and they're having a banquet, and they say, "Oh, Father Christmas gave us these things," and she says, "No, he didn't," and she says, "Say he didn't, and I'll spare your life. I'm going to execute you. But if you lie in front of everyone and say my version of the truth is the truth, then you get spared." And the little squirrel won't lie, and they all get turned into stone. Lewis, in many ways, is oddly like George Orwell. Very, very different views of the world, those two men, but they both write stories about talking animals and the nature of truth and totalitarianism. You know, it's really striking the way she moves from a political tyrant to someone who has to threaten other people with death and torture in order that her version of reality is the consensus version of reality. She's this very chilling picture of modern totalitarian tyranny.
We have to remember that when Edmund starts out with the Turkish Delight, his first interaction, his choices, he doesn't fully grasp the bigger picture, if you like. It's short-term gains for him. But as he journeys with her, he starts to see the suffering, the petrification of animals. He's tied up himself. And it's interesting how that sense of compassion is something we start to see through his character, and why that is significant then in his own redemption story and when he reunites with the siblings. I find it really interesting that basically Aslan says that, you know, we never hear the details of that conversation that he has with Aslan, but reflect a bit on Edmund's redemption and how his character is transformed.
There's a very telling little, I don't know, joke, comic bit where he's trudging off to the witch's house, and he's going through the snow, and it's very, very rough in the wood, and he cheers himself up by inventing laws that he's going to impose on the country when he gets his. You know, he invents railways and prisons, and there's something like, and just as he'd come up with some really good laws to get back at Peter, he fell over a tree branch. You know, it is funny, but it's a really nasty little a good insight into the nastiness of that blend of political power being used for personal purposes. And he gets deeper and deeper into this world, and he uses a stub of pencil, doesn't he, to scribble on the statue of a lion that he was scared of, you know, and he defaces the face of the lion, which of course is going to happen during the sacrifice scene, and then feels stupid and cheap about it. There's, as you said, there's these little moments where he does something and thinks, why am I the kind of person who does that sort of thing? And that, you're quite right, that breakthrough moment where he says, "Oh, please don't," and the witch is absolutely furious with him. You know, he begs mercy, not for himself, but for someone else. And I think that's the beginning of his little turnaround. Here we can feel the presence of Aslan in the spring and the sort of amazing transformed landscape, but there's that crucial moment where he says no. To quote Orwell, he does the opposite of "do it to Julia." He says he doesn't ask mercy for himself. He says, "Oh no, please don't." And there's just a hint there that something of Aslan's compassion and mercy has sort of entered his heart, and it gets worse for him because of that, and then it gets better.
Where does Aslan fit into the hierarchy of Narnia?
Very good question. Entirely outside it, I would suggest. If only because the they talk about him as the king of the wood, the king of beasts. You know, he's the great lion, etc. That could be the base of an excellent novel. That there is this wood, and within it is the king of the wood. But I think pretty quickly we realised that the badgers were speaking according to a badger understanding, if you like. They were using the badger analogia entice. You know, sorry, beavers, I should say, not badgers. What is it for a beast to recognise that which is beyond all comprehension? They call it the king of the wood, because that's the realm they know. And the resurrection of Aslan only works because there is the deeper magic from beyond the dawn of time, etc. Which sounds like, you know, a terrible bit of plotting where, oh, there's this magic that means you have to die. Actually, there's some magic that means I don't have to die. Again, and that's not what happens. You know, he does have to die, and then he's resurrected. And the sort of quibble or the plot point there is the witch can remember all time. And she can remember all time, which means she can't remember things that happened before time. She is part of the created order. And there's just a little whisper there of your sort of John's Gospel logos theology, that there is a presence that was there at the creation of all things, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that was made, etc. The novel is quite careful, I think, not to suggest that Aslan is this all-powerful beast or warlord or king. I mean, he's that as well, but we're not in a Manichaean universe where there's this evil side and this good side, and you should get on the side of good because it's good. It's managed in the plot that Aslan almost warps the genre of the novel. He almost warps good plotting and the way we expect things to happen in a satisfying novel, because he's not inside fiction. He is something greater than Narnia, greater even than the genre of mid-20th century children's fiction, if a thing such can be imagined. He's a beyond it, and therefore sort of spoken of by the characters in Narnia as the son of the emperor over the sea, the king of the wood, the great lion, and he's all these things, but he's also something more.
It's striking, isn't it, that the children actually believe in the power of Aslan and the goodness of Aslan before they even meet him, hearing about him through other characters like Mr. Tumnus and also Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. How important do you think that is when we think about the weight that these children are carrying, the expectations from other characters around them in Narnia, and yet here we have such a classic example of childlike faith?
Yeah, there's that moment, isn't there, when they say, Mr. B, who is Aslan, or is it first when he says Aslan is on the move, and it says at the name of Aslan they each felt this extraordinary feeling. Peter felt courageous, and Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror, and Susan felt as if a beautiful smell or piece of music had drifted past, and Lucy had that feeling that when you wake up and it's the first day of the summer holidays, which is as good a sketch of the idea of the power and the glory, life eternal, forever and ever, amen, I think, as you can give in a children's book. It was the beginning of the summer holidays. And they have, as you say, this sense that something mysterious that they don't, I keep using the word mysterious, but it is something mysterious they don't understand is happening, and that everyone around them who knows a bit more about it than they do is really struck, excited, concerned about it's going to change everything. But they also, as you say, have that individual personal experience. It isn't, they actually experience just the edge or the idea or the feeling of the presence of Aslan in that moment when he's spoken of. They don't have to wait until they actually see a lion standing in front of them. There are a series of moments. There's the coming of spring. Even when they get to the Hill of the Stone Table, or what we will later realize is the Hill of the Stone Table, I'm pretty sure they see a pavilion, a tent, with an ivory flag with a red lion fluttering in the breeze from the ocean. They see like an icon or a symbol or an image of Aslan, and then they see him himself. The novel, it's partly suspense, and it's good plotting. The novel needs to get us gradually towards this character who's terribly important but can't actually appear. But it is, as you say, a really interesting way of dramatizing the experience of faith.
Jem, can we talk a bit more about the Stone Table? And I guess as we think about C.S. Lewis's own personal faith and the nod to Jesus and Jesus' own crucifixion and resurrection as well. As you say, there are important differences, like, of course, Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days. With Aslan, it's a lot quicker, his resurrection. But we see so much similarity when we think about the witch and the way that she tortures Aslan and humiliates and mocks Aslan. And just her initial triumphant glee when she has this conversation with Aslan, and of course he offers his own life to release Edmund so that Edmund could be free.
Yeah, the sort of biblical parallels cluster much more strongly, don't they, among that section. We almost have a couple of chapters, or a few chapters, of sort of the passion narrative of Aslan. We have them falling asleep near a clearing, so we have the Garden of Gethsemane, and we have, again, lots of neat little reversals. So I think so his child audience can understand it better. He doesn't have a group of followers of Aslan who keep falling asleep when Aslan wants them to stay awake. Susan and Lucy should be asleep and tucked up like good young children, but they can't sleep, which is, I think, a more relatable experience for many children than not being able to get to sleep. And so they have their own Garden of Gethsemane moment. And then they are sort of the women standing at the cross where he says, you must stop here. And they sort of watch him go up the hill. He literally stumbles at one point, as in the Stations of the Cross. And he ends up on the stone table, which is this intriguing multi-layered symbol. If you look up the story of Moses on Mount Sinai in the King James Version, not the only version of the Bible that Lewis used, but the most dominant English version of the Bible at the time, it doesn't say stone tablets, it says stone tables, because though it uses the older English word table in the same way that Hamlet says, I'll set it down on the tables of my memory, little writing thing. So literally in the KJV, Moses brings the stone tables down, meaning slabs of stone. And it's that, and it's also a sort of a Neolithic monument. You can see stone tables all over Britain. People are jolly fond of saying, this is the actual lamppost that Lewis saw, or this is the Narnia door in Oxford. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, I don't know. But in many ways, more excitingly to me, the fact that in so many fields in Britain, you can come across the stone table, because it's clearly the equivalent of Stonehenge. It's just a flat stone with a trellis or whatever they call them, propping it up. So it's the passion narrative happening deep in the English countryside, and it's the thing that breaks the moment of redemption. So it's like the veil of the temple, or it's the grave that opens at the moment of the crucifixion. Lewis loves this. He loves layering symbol upon symbol upon symbol, and I think it identifies sort of the drift of his imagination. For him, the crucifixion, the resurrection are very close together. As you say, they are temporally closer in his fiction, possibly because you don't want the children hanging around on the hilltop for 3 days and 3 nights, or 2 days and 3 nights, but also because those sort of movements of the atonement, I think he wants to keep very close together, certainly in his theological writings. He gives the impression of wanting to wrap them up. And I think that works with the symbolism as well, because the stone table is both the cross and the tomb and the empty tomb and the broken veil of the temple and the open grave. It's all these things piled onto each other.
It's interesting that those themes of sacrifice and atonement, they continue to resonate with audiences and listeners and readers worldwide when it comes to so many other things in, literature, in films. When we think about the Marvel series and how popular it is that we want some kind of hero or heroine, but so many of them reside in humanity, and yet C.S. Lewis chose a lion. Do we know much about why he decided to choose that animal?
Another good question. First of all, I think it's another example of his sort of creative theological imagination making a metaphor or a symbol literal. So we got the 4,000 years of winter, or we've got the tables of stone, which misread look like a stone table, but they are a stone table. It's one of the messianic titles, isn't it? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. So in his world, this messianic figure is an actual lion. He takes that sort of symbolic image that's been used so much in the Christian tradition and makes it into a person. That speaks to part of his imagination and part of what thrills him about the Christian faith, that the messianic force, the salvatory force, is a person. It has, in his case, a mane. It has breath and a tongue. It's very, very clear. Absolutely no docetism in Narnia, no Arianism either. There are various moments that close off the great classical Christological heresies. Susan says, "You're not a," and the narrator says she couldn't bring herself to say ghost. No, quite rightly she shouldn't, because she's not a decetist. And then there's a big moment where he messily licks Lucy's forehead. I think it's the equivalent of put your hand in my wound. There's this sort of definite physicality. The line is it's kingly, and it's also a messianic title, and it also appears a lot in the Hebrew scriptures. There are lions all over the place, symbols of strength and danger and royalty. I can't answer more than that. Obviously, it's interesting that this is in many ways such an English countryside, or such a British countryside, perhaps I should say. It's all the colours that British countryside turns in the spring, and you've got the snow and you've got the trees and the flowers. But we don't have lions in this country. And I wonder whether that is another little quite sort of check to the vanity of the of the individual soul, that salvation for an English reader reading this novel in the 1950s doesn't come from the landscape that you're used to. Something has to come into it. That landscape speaks of the presence of that person, and it's in tune and was created by and through that person, and it is a person, but that person arrives from elsewhere. I wonder whether a lion as a symbol has that resonant sense of sort of kingliness and wildness and power, but also something that comes from far off, that would be excitingly incongruous to find padding round Stonehenge or something like that.
Fascinating thought. Jem, we could carry on for several more episodes on this book alone, but as we draw our discussion to a close, thinking about where we end up with the children, because actually we exit Narnia, and it would have been so easy to actually stay in that triumphant moment, seeing the kings and queens of Narnia as Lucy and Susan and Edmund and Peter became. And yet C.S. Lewis actually takes us back from that escapist realm to the hard reality of where they've just been playing hide and seek and try to escape the housekeeper. Why take us back there to finish things?
It's such a good point. Yes, I don't know whether he knew he was going to write a series. It seems unlikely that he knew this was going to be the beginning of 7. It feels much more self-contained as a novel than the later one. So as you say, it'd be easy to say, and they restored the golden age of Narnia. But he brings them back, and the impression I get is that this is part of the idea of enchantment. That just as very early on, Lucy is sort of faced with the idea that being a girl means being a daughter of Eve, and being a daughter of Eve, is more exciting than being a classical faun. That it is at their most Narnian when they reappear in our world, not when they start getting homesick for England, when they are most royal and most Narnia and doing what a medieval monarch should do. And I think that there's a very ambiguous line at the end where it says something like something about the professor, but that was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. Now you can read that as one way of saying, subscribe and like for more stories of an exciting world involving fauns and a lamppost. But I think you can also see it as, no, the real adventure was about to begin, because they had returned to our world, that our world is exciting, dramatic, enchanted, and it returns the novel to the life of the person reading it. It's the opposite of escapist. It gives you, the regnal titles of the children, Peter the Magnificent, Susan the Gentle, Lucy the Valiant, Edmund the Just. They all have medieval or Renaissance meanings. Magnificent meaning splendid, kingly, of high achievement. Gentle meaning not quiet and polite, but meaning of high birth, aristocratic. Valiant meaning not to be moved, standing out against things. Just meaning Edmund doesn't seem very just, does he? But he's been justified. He's the most just because he looked in the face of justice itself. They're given these titles which can also apply in our world. I think it's really interesting that it says, I always misquote this line, once a king and queen in Narnia, always a king and queen in Narnia, which is what Lewis did not write. He said, Aslan says, once a king and queen in Narnia, always a king and queen. And the sentence ends. My imagination always supplies that line, but I'm wrong. It's almost as if the achievement of the quest, which of course is not achieved by them, worst bit of fantasy plotting ever, our heroes do not succeed in their quest, but that the coronation after the quest is ended is almost commissioning them to then have this royal rule and then go and try and live their Narnian life in our world. They're almost being, and I think they're more explicitly in the later novels sent, but the crowning is the end of the quest in one sense, but it's also a great royal commissioning.
It's almost as if they finally understand their identity and get the opportunity then to put that learning, that experience, that journeying into practice in the real world, a world which is desperate for rescue and redemption. Fascinating, and I guess something that we can all relate to, whatever kind of decade we are reading and engaging with the novel, which has been so popular for so many years. Dr Jem Bloomfield, academic writer and reader in the Church of England, thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Thanks for the invitation. It's been enormously good fun.
For C.S. Lewis, it began with his imagination and an adventure involving a fawn carrying a brolly, a queen on a sledge, and a magnificent lion. At its simplest level, a fantasy world to enter, and at a deeper and profound level for many of us, an invitation to explore the meaning of sacrifice, redeeming love, and the hope for good to triumph. My thanks to you for listening today, and also to Rachel Gillis, UCB's producer of our Life Issues podcast. Do make sure you subscribe to the series.